Story 1. The Shadows of Time: How Sundials Divided the Day. It's morning. The kind of morning before hours, before minutes, even before breakfast routines. A time when there was no time, or rather, no mechanical time. The sky itself told the truth of the day, and the sun's slow crawl from horizon to horizon was the only metronome anyone had ever known. You live in a world where shadows are the calendar, and light defines your obligations. Time, in its most literal and ancient form, is drawn across the earth by the angle of the sun. Centuries before ticking clocks and glowing screens, people asked the simplest question in the world: what time is it? The answer wasn't found on a wrist or wall. It was read in shadows cast by standing stones, obelisks, or wooden posts. The sundial, in its many primitive and ornate forms, emerged from that question. But this isn't the story of invention as a eureka moment. This is the slow, dusty tale of observation, of celestial regularity, of the astonishing patience with which ancient humans made sense of something that moved imperceptibly and yet governed everything: the passage of daylight. The beginning of observation. It likely began in silence on open plains. Long before writing, before language formed into the shapes we now speak, there was the sky. Early humans, possibly tens of thousands of years ago, noticed a simple fact: the shadows changed. A tree, a rock, a person all cast dark shapes, but those shapes did not stay still. They lengthened and shrank. They leaned from one direction to another. That alone might have gone unnoticed, except that these changes seemed predictable. With enough repetition, enough seasons, sunrises, and stillness, even the most rudimentary observer could recognize a rhythm. These earliest timekeepers had no intention of creating an instrument. They simply watched. They sat in the long daylight of prehistory and began to learn that the sun did not just illuminate, it measured. It's hard to pin down exactly when this awareness began, but by the time civilizations like those of the Egyptians, Babylonians, and early Chinese flourished, the understanding of solar movement had become integral to life. Agriculture, religious festivals, governance, all were tied to the sky. Without the concept of hours, people still knew when to rise, when to tend to the fields, and when the day was nearing its end. Obelisks and noon shadows. The Egyptians, meticulous builders and celestial watchers, were among the first to formalize this knowledge into structured tools. Around 3500 BCE, they erected obelisks not merely as decorative or symbolic structures, but as early shadow clocks. These tall, tapering pillars stood in temple courtyards and city centers, casting long, narrow shadows across carefully leveled stone. The shadow of the obelisk would stretch westward in the morning and eastward in the afternoon. At high noon, the shadow would nearly disappear, the one moment of the day where it shrank into the base of the stone itself. That brief instance of verticality served as a reliable marker, the day's midpoint. From that central moment, time could be broken into before and after. But there was no rush. The day was not divided into hours yet. This was a broader sense of time. There was morning light, then the heat of the sun, and then a cooling decline into evening. These solar movements were tied to sacredness. Priests observed the shadows not only to track the day, but to signal moments for prayer, rituals, or the opening of temple doors. And because the sun's position changed slightly each day due to the tilt of the earth, though they didn't know that yet, the length of shadows changed across seasons. The winter solstice brought long, slow shadows. Summer brought shorter ones. It was not precise, but it was profoundly consistent, and in a time before seconds mattered, consistency was enough. Horizontal sundials and the first hour marks. Eventually, Egyptian engineers began carving flat, L-shaped sundials, horizontal plates with simple gnomons, the shadow-casting part of a sundial. These were placed so that the gnomon stood upright, and the shadow it cast could be read against a set of lines inscribed on the base. These lines divided the day into parts, but not evenly, not yet. In early models, there were 6 divisions. Why 6? Possibly because dividing the daylight into equal parts felt natural. Possibly because of how their mathematics favored base 12 systems. We can't say for sure. But from this, the concept of temporal hours began to emerge, 12 parts from sunrise to sunset. That meant an hour was longer in summer and shorter in winter. It was a flexible concept based on the sun's presence, not mechanical uniformity. These early dials were often portable, made of wood or stone, carried by priests or officials who needed to know the time for ceremonies or field labor. The precision was modest, but the cultural value was immense. Time was not private. It was not personalized. It was cosmic. To measure it was to participate in the divine. Babylon and the sexagesimal legacy. While the Egyptians were casting shadows across stone, the Babylonians were refining their celestial calculations. Their base 60, sexagesimal system wasn't just a numerical curiosity, it laid the groundwork for how we would later divide hours into minutes and seconds. But even at this early stage, they tracked the sun's movement with growing precision. Babylonian astronomers developed sundials with multiple hour lines, and even adjusted their readings based on the season. Some of these dials, unearthed from ruins like Sippar or Nineveh, show attempts to calibrate the curved path of the sun through the sky. They understood that shadows were not just static lines, but arcs changing daily. They even began to track the heliacal rising of stars, particularly Sirius, which signaled the flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates. Sundials were not isolated tools. They worked in tandem with star charts, water clocks, and observation logs. All of this was in the name of creating order not just for agriculture or trade, but for existence itself. Sundials in daily life. While much of our surviving evidence comes from religious or state contexts, sundials were increasingly used in the rhythms of daily life. In ancient Greece, they were built into public plazas. Citizens would pass by and note the hour marked by the shadow. In Rome, sundials were placed along streets or in the homes of the elite. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, complained about how sundials had changed society, lamenting that people had become slaves to time, checking the hours instead of living by nature. It's a complaint that echoes into the modern day, a reminder that even boring tools can cause cultural shifts. But there was a problem. Sundials only worked when the sun was visible. Clouds, storms, and most obviously nightfall rendered them useless. The pursuit of timekeeping had begun, but it was incomplete. The day could be measured in parts, but what about the night? The sundial, noble as it was, could only follow the sun. Humans would need more than shadows to measure their days. And so the question lingered: how do you tell time when the sun refuses to shine? The sundial, for all its grace and simplicity, was a prisoner of its own nature. It depended on light, and light is not always dependable. Clouds, architectural shadows, and the inevitable return of night each conspired to render the sundial mute for stretches of the day. Time, it seemed, needed more than the sun. It needed persistence. As civilizations grew more complex, with temples to maintain, canals to open, and armies to move, time had to become something you could carry, something you could measure, even in darkness. And so, the sundial, that original timekeeper, gradually became the inspiration for something more consistent: mechanical time. But before gears and springs, there was ingenuity in the form of water and sand. The limitations of light. Imagine an Egyptian priest preparing for a nocturnal rite, or a Roman engineer planning roadwork before dawn. In such moments, the absence of sunlight wasn't merely inconvenient, it was disruptive. Farmers still needed to know when to start their work. Watchmen still needed to change shifts. Rituals demanded precise timing, often beginning before sunrise or extending long after sunset. The sundial, as valuable as it had been, could not answer these demands. It had one fatal flaw: it disappeared each evening. And so, across different regions of the ancient world, people began to look for other mediums to track the slow movement of time. They sought materials that flowed as predictably as sunlight fell: water, sand, and eventually, fire. But before we examine those, we must understand a crucial philosophical shift: the movement from observing time to measuring it not by celestial cues, but by human-built rhythms. Water clocks, clepsydras and the sound of time. Enter the clepsydra, or water clock, one of the most important and most overlooked inventions in the history of timekeeping. Unlike the sundial, which was passive and dependent, the water clock was active. It didn't need the sky. It only needed gravity, a vessel, and a steady drip. The word clepsydra comes from Greek, meaning water thief, but its use predates the Greeks by centuries. The earliest known water clocks were found in ancient Egypt, dating back to around 1400 BCE. These were simple, yet surprisingly effective: a stone vessel with a small hole at the bottom. As water escaped slowly through the hole, marks on the interior wall indicated the passage of time by the changing water level. They weren't especially accurate, but they were continuous. The flow of water, if regulated, offered something the sundial could not: night hours. For ceremonial, judicial, or military purposes, this was revolutionary. Time had finally become independent of the sky. The Greeks refine and expand. The Greeks took the Egyptian clepsydra and transformed it into something more sophisticated. By the 5th century BCE, they had developed both inflow and outflow clepsydras, using multiple containers to improve the consistency of the flow rate. Some designs even included gears and floats that would raise a small figure or pointer as time passed. These devices became common in courtrooms. Ancient Greek law required strict time limits for speeches, and the clepsydra enforced them. One vessel's worth of water meant a fixed amount of speaking time. When the water ran out, so did the lawyer's opportunity to persuade the jury. It's a small, bureaucratic detail, but one worth pausing over. The measurement of time had begun to intrude on public life, not just on fields or in temples, but in the arguments of the agora. The clock was no longer just observational, it was administrative. Rome and the rise of temporal hours. The Romans, as was their custom, borrowed heavily from the Greeks and Egyptians. They inherited sundials and clepsydras, adapting them to fit their expanding empire. One notable Roman sundial, built by the censor Quintus Marcius Philippus around 263 BCE, was actually imported from Sicily as war booty and didn't match the latitude of Rome. For years, it gave inaccurate readings and no one corrected it. It's a humorous but telling detail. Even in a civilization famed for its engineering, the accuracy of timekeeping was sometimes negotiable. Still, the Romans made some efforts to refine things. They expanded the concept of hori, or hours, using 12 daylight hours and 12 night hours, just as the Egyptians had. But they pushed this further by standardizing temporal hours throughout the empire, a necessity for a sprawling network of roads, military camps, and bathhouses that all required coordinated routines. In many Roman cities, public sundials and clepsydras were maintained side by side. Time became dual-natured, one version for daylight, another for darkness. But consistency remained elusive. The length of a temporal hour still varied with the seasons. An hour in summer could stretch to 75 modern minutes. In winter, it might shrink to 45. Time in Rome was a suggestion, not yet a command. China's astronomer engineers. While the Mediterranean world was experimenting with shadows and water, ancient Chinese astronomers were crafting intricate instruments that combined observation with mechanical design. The Zhou dynasty, c. 1046–256 BCE, already had detailed records of solar paths and used gnomons to measure the sun's angle for seasonal calculations. But during the Han dynasty, clepsydras and sundials began to merge into elaborate systems of astronomical observation. Some designs included gears and armillary spheres to track celestial motion. By the 11th century CE, much later, Su Song would build an astronomical clock tower powered by a water-driven escapement mechanism, centuries before anything comparable existed in Europe. But even before that, Chinese engineers showed a fascination with making time mechanical, continuous, and cosmically aligned. Still, in the earlier periods, the goals remained familiar: mark solstices, regulate farming, and schedule rituals. Time served harmony, not profit. It wasn't yet the tyrant of schedules, it was a servant of the stars. Sacred time and public ritual. Across the world, timekeeping was often a sacred act. In Mesopotamia, priests tracked the stars to time sacrifices. In Mesoamerica, the movement of shadows on temples was used to align festivals with solstices. In India, sundials were placed in temple courtyards, often oriented to cast shadows upon holy icons at exact moments of prayer. These weren't merely acts of observation, they were performances of cosmic order. Time was divine, and to measure it was to participate in the sacred machinery of the universe. But as time became more measurable, it also became more manageable. And once it could be managed, it could be scheduled. And once it could be scheduled, it could be controlled. The sundial, once a spiritual companion to sunlight, was now one instrument in a growing toolkit of temporal authority. From personal shadows to public time. As cities grew, timekeeping slowly shifted from a private or religious act to a public necessity. Sundials in town squares, water clocks in courtrooms, and temple gongs ringing at intervals, these tools began to shape the behavior of populations. It's easy to forget now, but there was a time when your position in the sun or the sound of dripping water told you when to wake, work, worship, or rest. The concept of being late was beginning to form faintly, quietly, like a shadow lengthening across a courtyard. But still, it wasn't precise. Time varied from city to city, even from street to street, depending on the sundial's placement and alignment. There was no global time, no fixed minutes. Each place lived in its own solar truth. That would soon change. In the next phase of history, the sun would no longer be the final authority on time. The ticking of gears, the swing of pendulums, and the rise of mechanical clocks would bring about a revolution of precision, and with it, new anxieties, disciplines, and possibilities. But before we go there, we must ask, what happened to the sundial? What did it become in the age of mechanical time? The sun still rose. Shadows still stretched across stones, walls, and windowsills. But by the dawn of the 14th century, the ancient sundial, humanity's original timekeeper, began to lose its central role. As the mechanical clock ascended, the gnomon's dominance slowly waned. Yet, the sundial never fully vanished. Instead, it transformed from a tool of necessity into a symbol of tradition, philosophy, and eventually, aesthetic nostalgia. To understand its final arc in the great story of timekeeping, we must explore not only its technological obsolescence, but also its cultural persistence. The sundial's decline wasn't sudden. It was, much like its function, a slow, imperceptible shift, a fading shadow beneath the growing hum of gears and bells. From measurement to metaphor. By the late medieval period, Europe had begun constructing mechanical clocks, devices that didn't require sunlight or water, just iron, gravity, and careful engineering. These early tower clocks were not especially accurate, but they had one great advantage: they ticked on, regardless of the sky. In places like Milan, Strasbourg, and Salisbury, cathedrals and city centers boasted elaborate clocks with bells that chimed the hours. These clocks regulated monastic life, civic duties, and eventually market schedules. In short order, public life began to orient not around the sun's movement, but around the clock's chimes. Still, sundials persisted. Why? Partly because they were cheap and easy to construct. A simple vertical post and a properly calculated dial could serve a town or monastery quite well. Sundials were also still useful for setting mechanical clocks. In those early centuries of mechanization, clocks often drifted minutes gained or lost each day. Sundials, being rooted in the sun's actual position, served as calibration devices. They grounded the mechanical in the astronomical. But more importantly, sundials took on a philosophical role. As human awareness of time deepened and anxiety about its passage grew, the sundial became a quiet moralist, silently reminding viewers of the fleeting nature of life. In gardens, on towers, and engraved into stone walls, sundials began to bear Latin inscriptions like Tempus fugit, time flies, Umbra sumus, we are shadows, Horas non numo nisi serenas, I count only the sunny hours. These weren't just observations, they were reflections. The sundial, in its simplicity, became a contemplative object, a reminder that time is light and life is short. The Renaissance and the return to the sun. The Renaissance brought with it a revival of classical knowledge and a renewed interest in astronomy. Figures like Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, and Galileo re-examined the heavens not just for calendar reform, but for the very structure of the cosmos. Sundials found renewed scientific purpose. Scholars across Europe designed equinoctial, polar, and annulmatic sundials, each more mathematically precise than the last. These weren't just simple hour markers. Some sundials now calculated declination, ecliptic paths, and latitude corrections. Others were built into walls, aligned precisely to track solstices and equinoxes. Some universities and observatories constructed monumental sundials not for public timekeeping, but for astronomical research. The sundial, though fading from daily life, was elevated to scientific instrument once more. Still, even as the Renaissance yielded to the Enlightenment and clocks grew more accurate, the sundial remained in gardens, cloisters, and schools, often with inscriptions more poetic than practical. Colonialism and the global spread of the gnomon. As European empires expanded, so did their technologies. Sundials, both vertical and horizontal, were exported alongside churches, universities, and trading companies. In the Americas, India, and parts of Africa, sundials appeared in mission courtyards, public squares, and colonial outposts. They were often used to teach geometry and astronomy in colonial schools. Jesuit missionaries, in particular, promoted the construction of sundials as part of their educational and evangelical missions. Yet these instruments often sat alongside or in tension with indigenous ways of understanding time, many of which were cyclical, seasonal, or event-based rather than hourly. The imposition of sundials and mechanical clocks brought with it not just technology, but a worldview, one in which time was linear, divisible, and measurable, a resource to be budgeted. Sundials, once cosmic markers of agricultural and ritual time, were now tools in the machinery of empire. The garden dial and Victorian nostalgia. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the sundial had become decorative. No longer necessary, it became sentimental. In the gardens of Victorian England, sundials were placed as focal points, nestled among hedges and flower beds. They were not consulted for the time. Clocks and watches were too common for that. Instead, they were consulted for reflection. Poems were etched into their faces. Sonnets were written about their silence. In literature, the sundial became a symbol of patience, of dignity, of impermanence. In a world now accelerating with trains, factories, and telegraphs, the sundial stood still, literally, figuratively, philosophically. To some it offered comfort, to others melancholy. Always it offered slowness. Scientific sundials and educational tools. Even into the 20th century, sundials continued to be constructed for educational purposes. Many universities and observatories kept working sundials on their grounds. Modern sundials were used to demonstrate the Earth's tilt, the concept of apparent solar time, and the discrepancy known as the equation of time, the difference between sundial time and clock time. In classrooms and science museums, students learned how to calculate their latitude using a gnomon and how to align a dial to true north. It was no longer about telling time, but understanding it, how time relates to space, motion, and the turning of our planet. Some engineers and hobbyists still build digital sundials, using carefully aligned slits or 3D printed shapes to cast shadows that actually spell out the hour in numerals. In this way, the sundial lives on not as relic, but as curiosity. The lingering shadow. In the end, the sundial's story is one of quiet resilience. It was never the most accurate instrument. It could not work at night. It failed in bad weather. And yet, for thousands of years, it did the job elegantly, silently, using nothing but the sun and a stick. It was democratic. It required no fuel, no winding, no expensive parts. It asked only for sunlight and attention. It taught patience and consistency. It reminded people daily that time came from the heavens, not from human invention. And even as clocks ticked, towers chimed, and satellites beamed signals across the globe, the sundial remained. Not because it had to, but because it still meant something. Because even in a world of atomic clocks, some still prefer to tell time by the turning of the earth and the slow movement of shadows. So the next time you pass an old sundial, perhaps faded, perhaps forgotten, ask yourself, is it broken, or is it simply waiting for the sun to return? Story 2. The clepsydras whisper water clocks of the ancient world. In a still room, a single drop of water falls, then another, then another. In each measured droplet is a moment passed, not rushed, not hurried, just gone. For the ancients, this was time incarnate, soft, fluid, patient. Before the loud gears of mechanical clocks and the celestial confidence of sundials, there was the clepsydra, the water thief. It did not shine like bronze or echo across city squares. It whispered. Yet for over 2,000 years, it was the most consistent tool available for tracking the passage of hours, especially when the sun had disappeared or the skis refused to cooperate. The principle of the clepsydra. The clepsydra, or water clock, is elegant in its simplicity. It is a container, often stone, bronze, or ceramic, with a small hole drilled near its base or side. Water either drips out from the container or drips in, depending on the design. Time is measured by either the level of the water or the amount collected. But behind that simplicity lies remarkable insight. The concept relies on the constancy of flow rate, a principle now fundamental to physics and engineering. Ancient people, with no formal training in fluid dynamics, nonetheless understood that with a small enough hole and consistent water pressure, they could produce a predictable passage of time. This predictability allowed them to structure their days, regulate social activities, and eventually develop more advanced observational astronomy. Unlike the sundial, which required light and clear skis, the clepsydra worked anywhere, indoors, underground, in darkness, even in secret. Egypt's quiet innovation. While the earliest uses of water as a time-measuring tool are debated, the Old Kingdom of Egypt, around 2400 BCE, offers some of the earliest concrete examples. Egyptian priests needed precise measurements for nighttime rituals, often aligned with star risings and sacred intervals. The famous Amenemhit clepsydra, dating to around 1400 BCE during the reign of Amenhotep III, is a stone bowl with graduated interior markings. As water flowed out through a tiny hole, the falling level indicated how much time had passed. These clocks were likely used to time the length of priestly duties, temple operations, and ritual performances, particularly during periods of astronomical observation. Egyptians marked hours not in precise 60-minute blocks, but in temporal hours, 12 divisions of day and 12 of night, which varied with the seasons. Thus, clepsydras had to be recalibrated or read differently depending on the time of year. The tool was simple, but the interpretation was sophisticated. The very act of building such a device required planning and observation knowledge of how long it took for water to drain, how to create regular flow, and how to match that with seasonal changes in night length. It speaks to a culture that valued not just time, but the faithful tracking of it in darkness. Greece and the legal hour. In the 5th century BCE, the clepsydra became more than a priestly tool, it became a tool of the state. In Athens, democracy was developing rapidly, and with it, the need for structured public discourse. In the bustling law courts, time needed to be controlled, not just measured, but allocated. Enter the clepsydra. Greek versions of water clocks were now used to limit the speaking time of lawyers and litigants in court. A large clay or bronze vessel would be filled with water, and a small hole at the bottom would allow it to drain at a predictable rate. Once the water was gone, the speaker's time was up. This wasn't just a procedural detail. It was an innovation in civic fairness. No speaker could dominate the floor indefinitely. The water clock enforced limits that ensured, in theory at least, equality of voice, a strikingly modern concept. Aristotle mentions the use of water clocks in his Constitution of the Athenians, noting that they were also used to time public assemblies, ensuring debates didn't spiral into all-day affairs. In a world where political power rested on rhetoric, the clepsydra gave silence its due. The mechanics evolve. The Greeks, never content with simplicity, began to refine the clepsydra. One challenge was the changing flow rate as water drained. The pressure dropped, slowing the drip. To counter this, some engineers designed inflow clepsydras, where water flowed in from a regulated source, maintaining constant pressure. Others added scales and floats, which rose with the water level, and pointed to markings on the vessel, early prototypes of what we might call clock faces. Some designs included bells or automata that signaled the end of a time period. The mathematician and engineer Ctesibius of Alexandria, 3rd century BCE, created an astonishing clepsydra that included gears, weights, and an escapement mechanism, a forerunner to mechanical clocks. His device not only measured time but displayed it visually with moving indicators. Ctesibius' clock was powered by a constant water flow, driving a gear train that turned a cylindrical display. Though few of these devices survived in the archaeological record, descriptions from later Roman authors like Vitruvius provide detailed insights into their complexity. These were not toys or curiosities. They were early computers of motion and time. Rome's order and the watch. As with so many Greek innovations, the Romans inherited and adapted the clepsydra. In Rome, time was increasingly a matter of public regulation. The empire needed to schedule military watches, manage urban infrastructure, and maintain ritual calendars. Water clocks were used to time night watches in garrisons and changes in guard shifts. Roman clepsydras were also used in baths to regulate sessions, a practical application that ensured equitable use. But here too, limitations appeared. Maintaining a water clock required careful calibration, constant attention, and above all, water clean, reliable, and flowing at a consistent temperature and pressure. In winter, freezing temperatures could halt operation altogether. Still, for their time, clepsydras offered the closest thing to a portable time standard. No need for stars, no need for shadows, just a vessel and a trickle. In India and Persia, time is flowing rhythm. Outside the Greco-Roman world, water clocks found parallel development in ancient India and Persia. In India, the Gadi yantra or Jala yantra was used in temples and courts to time rituals and judicial proceedings. Sanskrit texts refer to water clocks in astronomical observatories like those at Ujjain, with remarkably consistent measurements. The water clock was part of Jyotisha, the traditional Hindu system of astronomy and astrology. Similarly, Persian astronomers, particularly during the Sasanian era, constructed water clocks known as fenjan vessels with holes placed in cisterns. As the fenjan filled and sank, it marked time intervals. These were often used in astrological and calendrical systems tied to Zoroastrian traditions. Unlike in the West, where clocks became associated with scheduling labor and limiting speech, These devices remained closely tied to cosmic balance and ritual order. They were instruments of alignment, not control. The limitations remain. Despite refinements, water clocks were never perfect. Evaporation could change flow rates. Temperature changes affected viscosity and speed. Lime deposits clogged holes. Refilling required constant human attention. Transport was difficult. Most clocks were stationary. These problems eventually led to their replacement in practical contexts. But for over 1,000 years, water clocks remained the best way to track time indoors, in darkness, or during long observations of the night sky. More than that, they shaped how humans conceptualized time as something fluid, measurable, but always slipping away. We'll explore how water clocks evolved during the Islamic Golden Age, how they were perfected in China, and how they influenced early mechanical clocks in medieval Europe. But for now, consider the drip of water in a still room, the earliest sound of time, soft and slow. How did the whisper of water become the tick of a clock? Time flowed onward, and so did the water. By the early medieval period, the clepsydra had already seen centuries of use, quietly regulating speeches in Greek courts, overseeing Egyptian rituals, and marking hours in Roman baths. But its story was far from over. In fact, some of its most sophisticated and ingenious developments were yet to come. Between the 8th and 14th centuries, a convergence of astronomical ambition, mechanical ingenuity, and religious discipline gave rise to a new era for water clocks, particularly across the Islamic world and China. The water clock was no longer just a timepiece. It became a symbol of knowledge, a marvel of engineering, and in some cases, a spectacle designed to awe, inspire, and educate. The Islamic Golden Age, astronomy meets engineering. During the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, the world witnessed an extraordinary flowering of scientific knowledge. Scholars gathered in libraries and observatories to translate Greek texts, build upon Indian mathematics, and develop innovations of their own. Among the many fields cultivated, astronomy and horology, the study of time held a special place. After all, Islamic religious practices required precise timing. The 5 daily prayers, the lunar calendar, and the fasting schedule of Ramadan. Knowing when the sun rose, when it passed the zenith, and when it dipped below the horizon was of both spiritual and civic importance. Al-Jazari and the art of the water clock. In the 13th century, a remarkable engineer named B'Adi al-Zaman, Abu al-Bf Ibn Ism a Makron Bf I Makron, El Ibn al-Razaz al-Jazari, usually known as al-Jazari, authored a masterpiece titled The Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. Within its pages, al-Jazari detailed over 100 machines, including several water clocks of incredible complexity. These were not simple drip vessels. His designs included elephant clocks, featuring multiple water tanks, floating bowls, automata, and even mechanical birds that chirped on the hour. Castle clocks, tall and elaborately decorated, with moving figures, doors that opened, zodiac dials, and mechanisms triggered by precise intervals of water flow. Portable basin clocks, allowing time to be carried, observed, and displayed an early vision of time on the go. What made al-Jazari's clocks so innovative was not just their function, but their integration of gears, cams, levers, and flow regulators, precursors to the escapement mechanisms of later mechanical clocks. His elephant clock, for example, represented a microcosm of the known world, combining Indian, Egyptian, Persian, Greek, and Chinese elements, a multicultural symbol of temporal harmony. But these devices weren't mass-produced. They were showpieces commissioned by rulers, installed in palaces, and used to demonstrate the sophistication of science under Islamic patronage. They also served a deeply educational purpose, illustrating not just the passage of time, but the interplay between engineering, religion, and cosmology. China's hydraulic wonders. While Al-Jazari was designing elephant clocks in Upper Mesopotamia, Chinese engineers had long been constructing complex water-driven mechanisms that dwarfed even the most elaborate European clocks of the time. Susong's astronomical clock tower. In the 11th century, during the Song dynasty, the scholar official Su Song created one of the most advanced water clocks in world history, the astronomical clock tower in Kaifeng. Built around 1090 CE, Su Song's tower was over 30 feet tall, featuring a celestial globe that rotated to show the positions of stars and planets, armillary spheres aligned with astronomical observations, multiple clock faces that displayed hours, minutes, and celestial data, an intricate water wheel escapement mechanism centuries before such technology would reach Europe. At the heart of the device was a clepsydra, regulated by a scoop wheel and chain drive. As water filled and emptied precise scoops, it turned gears that powered the clockwork. On the hour, automated figures would emerge from doors to strike bells or gongs, announcing the time. The entire structure served both practical and symbolic functions. It tracked the movement of heavenly bodies, assisting in calendar reform. It unified political and cosmic order. The emperor, aligned with the heavens, literally made time visible to his people. It reminded onlookers of the regularity and majesty of the universe. Unfortunately, the tower was destroyed during the Jurchen invasion of Kaifeng in 1127, but Su Song's detailed diagrams and writings preserved its legacy. Europe's rediscovery of flowing time. Back in Europe, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire led to a general decline in technological innovation, but not total stagnation. Monasteries across the continent continued to use simple clepsydras to regulate canonical hours, particularly during long winter nights when sundials were useless. The Rule of Saint Benedict, a foundational monastic code from the 6th century, required vigilant timekeeping for regular prayer. Though early clocks were often just candle timers or hourglasses, the water clock remained useful, especially in cloisters with access to running water. Some Benedictine monasteries, particularly in southern Europe, had elaborate water management systems, aqueducts, and cisterns that allowed for the maintenance of tower clepsydras. These clocks would ring bells to call monks to matins, lauds, and other services, regardless of season. Still, the technology lagged behind what was being developed in the Islamic and Chinese worlds. It would take the reintroduction of ancient texts, often translated via Arabic into Latin, to spark renewed innovation in the West. From flow to tick, bridging to mechanical time. As European scholars began to study texts from Islamic Spain and the Eastern Mediterranean, ideas from Greek, Arab, and Persian engineers began to take root again in medieval universities. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the limitations of water clocks were becoming more pronounced. Water flow was still inconsistent, especially with seasonal temperature changes. Cleaning and maintenance were constant challenges. Precision was improving, but still too variable for accurate astronomy. Engineers began experimenting with weights, gears, and escapement mechanisms that didn't rely on fluid dynamics. Around 1300, the first mechanical clocks began to appear in Europe, first in monasteries and cathedrals, then in public towers. These new clocks borrowed from water clock principles, especially in their use of regulated intervals and striking mechanisms. The idea of marking the hour with sound, a legacy of clepsydras, was preserved, even as the method changed. Eventually, the clepsydra was displaced but not forgotten. A device of continuity. Through all these developments, the water clock never fully disappeared. It remained in use as educational tools for teaching astronomy. backup timekeepers in observatories, symbols of wisdom in art and literature, sacred instruments in ritual traditions. The sound of dripping water, slow, steady, inevitable, persisted even as the mechanical tick took over. In China, in Persia, in Europe, and beyond, it shaped how people imagined time, as continuous, gentle, and yet impossible to stop. In Section 3, we'll explore the final legacy of water clocks, their symbolic afterlife in science, art, and memory, and how the steady drip of time still echoes in modern tools. But before we move ahead, pause and imagine. In a silent observatory, deep in the night, the only sound is the drop, drop, drop of water falling from a carved spout into a shallow bowl. When did we begin to trade the sound of water for the tick of a gear? There is something undeniably human in the way a vessel slowly empties. It reflects our own lives, quiet, persistent, and gently eroding. As the world marched onward into the age of precision, industry, and mechanics, the clepsydra, once a marvel of observation and ingenuity, faded from use. But it did not vanish entirely. Much like the slow drip it once measured, the influence of the water clock lingered in our language, our imagination, our science, and even in our quietest metaphors for time itself. This final section explores how the clepsydra, while eclipsed by modernity, left behind a symbolic legacy, a ripple that can still be seen if you know where to look. A slow retreat from practicality. By the 15th century, the water clock had become largely obsolete in Europe and the Middle East. The invention of the verge escapement and the weight-driven mechanical clock made for more consistent timekeeping without the limitations of temperature, mineral buildup, or constant refilling. In major cities, clock towers now rose high above the rooftops, powerful symbols of civic order. These clocks were set not by flowing water, but by swinging pendulums and precise gear ratios. The clepsydra, once a state-of-the-art instrument used by judges, astronomers, monks, and engineers, was relegated to libraries, curiosity cabinets, and garden fountains. In China and the Islamic world, water clocks held on a bit longer in ceremonial and scholarly contexts, but by the 17th century, even they gave way to newer technologies imported from Europe. Still, the clepsydra was not forgotten. Philosophers and the fluidity of time. Time, philosophers began to argue, was not a rigid sequence of ticks, it was a flow, a continuum, something that moved like a current rather than clicked like a gear. In the 18th and 19th centuries, natural philosophers, poets, and even physicists turned to fluid metaphors to describe time. The image of a leaking vessel, of time slowly draining away, became common in art and writing. The clepsydra appeared in allegorical paintings and sculptures, particularly those dealing with mortality, fate, or cosmic order. Unlike the hourglass, which had by then taken over as the favored symbol of time's passage, the water clock still suggested movement rather than division. In Renaissance allegories, the clepsydra was sometimes associated with truth, patience, or divine watchfulness, attributes connected to water itself. Time was no longer a celestial measure or a mechanical tool, but a state of being, something to contemplate. Museums and memory. Today, working clepsydras can be found in museums, science centers, and historic reconstructions. While few ancient examples survived the millennia, most having been made of ceramic or bronze that was repurposed, detailed descriptions from Vitruvius, Al-Jazari, Susong, and others have allowed for recreations. Many of these replicas are now educational. They demonstrate the early human ability to observe, record, and apply natural phenomena to solve abstract problems like measuring something as intangible as time. They also serve as reminders that timekeeping was never purely about utility. It was tied to belief, to ritual, to power, and to meaning. The clepsydra was a bridge between cosmic order and human action, linking the stars to the courtroom, the temple, and the city square. The water clock in literature and culture. In modern times, water clocks occasionally appear in fiction, symbolism, and metaphor. You might find them in fantasy or historical novels, where ancient technologies are rediscovered or reimagined. In philosophical essays about the nature of time, memory, or consciousness. In architectural design, as quiet centerpieces, meditative, flowing, and purposeful. They evoke a different kind of time, not the time of business meetings or train schedules, but the time of gardens, prayers, and waiting. The word clepsydra itself still appears in poetry and art, its soft syllables suggesting not precision, but persistence. Scientific echoes, flow, and continuity. Even in science, the clepsydra left a quiet legacy. In modern fluid dynamics, flow meters, and hydraulic engineering, the core principles remain. Some laboratories in the 19th and early 20th centuries even used dripping mercury clocks for ultra-precise time intervals before electronics took over. And more abstractly, the clepsydra still haunts theoretical discussions of entropy, decay, and irreversible processes. As physicists came to understand time not as a universal constant, but as a direction, the arrow of time, the image of a vessel emptying became a useful metaphor. You cannot undrip water. You cannot refill the vessel without effort. Time, like water in a clepsydra, flows one way. The clepsydra in us. Perhaps what makes the water clock so enduring even as a relic is that it reminds us that time was once a matter of attention. You had to watch it. You had to be near it. You had to maintain it. It did not beep. It did not alert. It did not glow in the dark. It simply existed, flowing slowly, asking for your patience. It was never accurate to the second, and it never needed to be. It measured time not by dictating it, but by inviting you to observe it. In an age of automation, where time chimes from phones, cars, and satellites without us noticing, the clepsydra represents something quieter, something lost. It measured not just moments but mindfulness. Closing reflections. So what became of the clepsydra? It was not destroyed nor defeated. It simply faded as better tools emerged. But its core idea that time could be known through nature, through regularity, through persistence is still with us. We live now by ticking seconds, but once, time dripped softly in the corner of a silent room. And perhaps even now, there's something soothing in that image. A quiet vessel, a steady drop, a flow you can count but never stop. Story 3. Sand and Patience, the Hourglass and the Medieval Mind. It begins, as all things do, with falling. A single grain of sand drifts through the neck of a glass vessel, then another, so small, so insignificant, and yet together they form a measure of something immense, time. Unlike the sun that rules the skies or the water that whispers in bowls, the hourglass offers a different kind of precision. It does not depend on weather, light, or machinery. It simply turns and waits. The hourglass is often romanticized now, seen in desktop toys, poetic metaphors, or the tattooed wrists of those contemplating mortality. But in its prime, during the High and Late Middle Ages, it was a tool of enormous practical power, a quiet agent of control, routine, and rhythm. And it emerged into a world in desperate need of certainty. A medieval world of disorder. To understand the rise of the hourglass, we must first consider the context of medieval Europe. It was a world of fragmented authority, erratic infrastructure, and limited literacy. Mechanical clocks were rare and expensive, often housed in cathedrals or elite towers. Water clocks, though still in use in monasteries and courts, were delicate and prone to malfunction. Meanwhile, daily life remained ruled by approximation, the ringing of bells, the cycle of sun and shadow, and the instincts of the body. Time was flexible. A task was done not at a time, but until it was finished. Into this hazy framework came the hourglass, exact, self-contained, and surprisingly portable. Origins: a clouded beginning. The precise origin of the hourglass is difficult to pin down. While sand clocks may seem obvious in concept, they require significant technical knowledge to construct effectively. Glassblowing needed to be advanced enough to produce airtight, uniform bulbs. Sand selection was crucial. Coarse or moist grains would clog the neck, too fine, and the flow would become inconsistent. Sealants had to prevent humidity and leakage over time. There are no clear references to hourglasses in ancient texts, and archaeological evidence is scarce before the 8th or 9th century CE. The first reliable depictions emerge in the 14th century, notably in ship logs and monastic records. But many scholars believe hourglass prototypes may have existed earlier, perhaps influenced by Byzantine or Islamic experimentation with enclosed timekeeping devices. It is possible that the hourglass evolved independently in multiple regions, quietly, and without formal attribution, the kind of slow invention that arrives not with a flash, but with a shrug. First appearances: monks and mariners. Where the hourglass first gained traction, it did so for very specific practical reasons. In monasteries, monastic life in medieval Europe was governed by the rule of St. Benedict, which divided the day into fixed periods of prayer, work, and rest. As monastic orders expanded, particularly the Benedictines and Cluniacs, the need for accurate timekeeping, especially during long, dark winter nights, grew. The hourglass offered monks a quiet, reliable, and non-mechanical means of tracking intervals between canonical hours. Unlike candles or clepsydras, it required no tending, just a glance and an occasional turn. Some abbeys are believed to have used hourglasses of different sizes to time periods of silence, reading, or cooking. These were humble tools, but within cloisters, they supported a spiritual architecture of discipline. At sea, mariners embraced the hourglass even more enthusiastically. On a ship, mechanical clocks were almost useless. The motion of the vessel disrupted pendulums and weights. Water clocks were vulnerable to splashing, tilting, or freezing. But the hourglass, it worked anywhere, steady, sealed, unaffected by motion. By the 13th century, European ships were equipped with multiple hourglasses, used to time shifts during night watches, measure distance in knots, a system based on tossing a rope with evenly spaced knots overboard, and counting how many pass through the sailor's hands during a set hourglass interval. Track speed and estimate location during long voyages. In this way, the hourglass became a nautical standard, carried on voyages from the English Channel to the Indian Ocean. It was simple, inexpensive, and most importantly, trusted. Constructing the perfect hourglass. Making an effective hourglass was far from easy. Every part had to be precise. Glass bulbs were hand-blown and fused at the neck, a delicate operation. The neck opening had to be narrow and consistent. Too wide, and the sand fell in a clump. Too narrow and it jammed. The sand was often not sand at all. Craftsmen used crushed eggshell, powdered marble, lead shot, or burnt lime materials less susceptible to clumping than actual sand. The seals were made with wax, pitch, or resin to ensure a moisture-free environment. The interval, often 30 minutes or 1 hour, had to be verified through multiple tests before the hourglass was considered reliable. Unlike mechanical clocks, which were visible symbols of wealth and innovation, hourglasses were personal, private, and profoundly unassuming. They made no sound. They had no hands. They required no interpretation. They simply flowed, expanding use in daily life. By the 15th century, hourglasses had become common across Europe. In homes, they were used to time sermons, boil eggs, or structure study. In churches, they regulated homilies and confession sessions. In workshops, craftsmen used them to limit labor intervals or pace apprentices. They were also popular in schools to enforce standardized exam or recitation periods, printing presses to time ink setting or drying, hospitals and apothecaries, where medicinal procedures often required precise timing. The hourglass began to represent something new, the idea that time could be managed, domesticated, and contained. In a world still ruled by uncertainty, plague, war, famine, the hourglass offered a tiny kingdom of predictability. A personal cosmos measured out in powder. The hourglass and the sense of self. Perhaps what made the hourglass especially powerful was its visual clarity. Unlike a clock face, which required numbers and mental mapping, the hourglass could be watched directly. You saw the sand disappear, grain by grain. You watched your time run out, visibly, tangibly. It did not abstract time, it embodied it. This feature made it particularly effective as a memento mori, a reminder of mortality. In medieval and Renaissance art, hourglasses appear alongside skulls, wilted flowers, and extinguished candles. They became symbols of vanitas, the fleetingness of earthly pursuits. But they were not morbid, not entirely. The hourglass was also hopeful. It could be turned. The sand could fall again. Time lost could be followed by time renewed. In this way, the hourglass became both a tool and a meditation. A turning point ahead. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, new technologies would challenge the supremacy of the hourglass. The rise of mechanical escapement, clocks, pendulums, and eventually spring-wound watches brought new levels of accuracy and convenience. But the hourglass endured in ships, in homes, and in memory. It represented not just time measured, but time felt. The world was getting bigger. By the late 15th century, the age of exploration had begun in earnest. Sailors from Spain, Portugal, England, and elsewhere were pushing beyond familiar waters, venturing into unknown seas. These voyages required not just courage, but coordination, the careful alignment of ship, sea, sky, and schedule. In a world without GPS, radar, or satellite clocks, the most dependable guide aboard a ship was not always the compass. It was the hourglass. Simple, sealed, and unaffected by the rocking of the vessel, the hourglass became a fundamental navigational tool, the quiet heartbeat of the ship. It ticked with sand instead of sound, and in doing so, it shaped the rhythms of a rapidly expanding world. Sailing by the glass. Life at sea was ruled by watches, not the wrist-bound kind, but work shifts, generally organized into periods of 4 hours. These watches helped structure the day for sailors, dividing labor, rest, and responsibilities in a predictable pattern. But how did you know when 4 hours had passed? Not by the stars, cloud cover often obscured them. Not by the sun, not always visible and not precise. Not by bells, those marked time but did not measure it. Instead, a half-hour hourglass was turned again and again by the ship's timekeeper. Every time the glass was flipped, a bell was rung. 1 bell for the first half hour, 2 bells for the second, and so on until 8 bells marked the end of a 4-hour watch. This tradition, known as the ship's bell system, persists even today in naval traditions. The glass wasn't just ceremonial, it regulated meal preparation, maintenance tasks, navigation measurements, crew discipline, night shift rotations. Without a functioning hourglass, a ship could drift not just physically, but socially. The glass was the center of order. Sand and the knot, measuring speed. The hourglass played another role aboard, measuring the ship's speed. This was accomplished using a log line, a rope knotted at regular intervals, tied to a wooden board and thrown overboard at the stern. As the ship moved forward, the log remained behind in the water, allowing the rope to unwind. A sailor would let the rope run free for a measured period, usually 30 seconds, timed by a smaller sand glass. Then the line was stopped, and the number of knots that had passed through the sailor's hands was counted. This is the origin of the nautical mile per hour, or the knot. The hourglass in this case was not a philosophical symbol, it was a tool of quantification. The voyage depended on it. Entire maps were charted based on data timed in falling sand. Exploration and empire. As ships crossed oceans, hourglasses traveled with them. Columbus, Magellan, and Vasco da Gama all relied on them. In fact, it's reported that Magellan's flagship, the Trinidad, carried over 18 hourglasses, all calibrated and maintained daily. They became so crucial that some ships assigned specific crew members to the care and flipping of the hourglasses. This wasn't a task left to chance. In the age of empire, time was territory and sand was how you measured it. In the holds of colonial vessels, hourglasses marked time not only for navigation but for religious observance, military drills, and discipline. In distant forts and trading posts, the hourglass maintained the routines of those seeking to bring European order to unfamiliar lands. Reformation, timekeeping, and moral discipline. Back on land, the Reformation brought with it a new emphasis on personal discipline, punctuality, and the efficient use of time. Protestant reformers, especially in Calvinist regions, encouraged the view that time was a gift from God, not to be wasted. The hourglass appeared in sermon illustrations, household manuals, and church pulpits, often literally mounted on them to time the preacher's speech. In some Puritan congregations, hourglasses ensured that sermons did not stray into excessive length, or that they reached a minimum threshold of theological instruction. The turning of the glass at the halfway point could be a moment of either groaning or relief. In homes, hourglasses were used during morning devotions, reading aloud, child discipline, go sit for one glass, household chores. They were modest, moral tools, and in a world of increasing print literacy and religious instruction, they were widely understood. The hourglass in commerce and the workshop. As towns and cities grew, and trades became more structured, the hourglass also found a place in the marketplace and workshop. In printing presses, sandglasses timed the setting of ink, the pressing of pages, the drying of materials. In bakeries, they ensured even cooking. In medical practice, they were used to time therapies, herb steeping, or the waiting periods between dosages. Even alchemists and early chemists relied on hourglasses to time phases of their experiments, long before lab timers existed. The hourglass brought repeatability, a key step in the growth of science. It didn't just mark time, it standardized procedures. And because it was simple to operate, required no reading, and was relatively cheap, it spread widely across classes, regions, and professions. Art, time, and mortality. During the Renaissance and Baroque periods, the hourglass took on symbolic power. In paintings and engravings, it appears. In still life vanitas scenes, beside skulls and rotting fruit. In allegorical images of Father Time, often paired with a scythe. On gravestones, sometimes winged to show that time flies. For all its utility, the hourglass also became emotional, a memento mori, a reminder that life is as finite as the sand in the bulb. Unlike a clock whose ticking is invisible, the hourglass shows you the loss. It's physical, gradual, inevitable. This led poets and preachers alike to meditate on it. Behold the glass, how swift its sands do run, and mark how soon our longest days are done. For centuries, to turn an hourglass was not merely to begin a task, but to acknowledge a truth that time could be held, seen, and lost. Cracks in the glass. Despite its enduring appeal, the hourglass had limits. It required regular reversal. The flow rate could vary with humidity. The duration was fixed, one glass for one task. It couldn't chime or provide multiple readings. and it offered no precise record, no history of what had passed. As mechanical clocks became smaller, more reliable, and more affordable, especially with the invention of the pendulum clock in the 17th century, hourglasses slowly began to fade from their practical roles. But not from memory. In the final section of this story, we'll explore how the hourglass endured in culture long after it vanished from everyday life as symbol, ritual object, and quiet companion in the story of time. But for now, picture a dark ship lit by lanterns rocking quietly on the sea. A sailor turns the hourglass. A bell rings once. Another glass begins. How many lifetimes have passed by the silent fall of sand? By the 18th century, the hourglass was no longer the authority it once had been. Pendulum clocks now ruled the rooms of churches, parliaments, and homes. Pocket watches ticked in waistcoats, measuring time with gears instead of grains. The Industrial Revolution loomed, bringing with it a tidal wave of synchronization, standardization, and punctuality. But the hourglass did not disappear. It simply became something else. No longer a primary timekeeper, it found a second life as symbol, object of ritual, and metaphor, living on not in factories or ship decks, but in human consciousness. The symbol of a new awareness. As scientific understanding of the universe expanded, so did philosophical contemplation of time itself. In this atmosphere, part rational, part poetic, the hourglass became a powerful image. In literature, it evoked the inevitability of endings. In art, it stood for the delicate balance of the present between past and future. In architecture, it appeared as ornamentation on clocks, tombstones, and sundials. In Freemasonry and alchemical symbolism, the hourglass served as a reminder that wisdom requires awareness of time's passage. Its form, with two mirrored bulbs, also invited new interpretations. Some philosophers saw it as a visual metaphor for cyclical time, for repetition, or even for the universe's hourglass-shaped spacetime structure, though that would come much later. Still, despite these elevated uses, the hourglass remained accessible. Everyone had seen one. Everyone understood it. You didn't need to read Latin or understand mechanics. You only needed to watch the sand fall. Time rituals and the personal hourglass. Throughout the 19th and into the early 20th century, the hourglass found a place in rituals and private spaces. In school, small sand timers were used to teach children about punctuality. In games, they added urgency and fairness, a democratized version of the judicial clepsydra. In kitchens, they helped time eggs, tea, and baking. In spiritual practices, they became tools of meditation, a minute of silence, a 5-minute reflection. These were not the ornate gilded hourglasses of Baroque paintings. They were modest, wooden, glass, and sand, often dyed pink or blue, but they still held the core promise, to measure a fixed period, quietly and without interruption. And in that stillness, they reminded users that time was not only to be scheduled but felt. The hourglass as mourning and memory. Gravestones from the 18th and 19th centuries often include carvings of hourglasses, sometimes winged, sometimes cracked. These were not accidental. They expressed a widely shared view that life is brief, time is fleeting, death is inevitable. The winged hourglass in particular suggested not only that time flies, but that time itself escapes us, with or without our consent. It flew upward, away from the earth, beyond human control. In literature, especially romantic poetry, the hourglass often appeared as a melancholy image, elegant, inevitable, and humbling. Even today, memorial art sometimes includes hourglasses in sculptures, stained glass, or inscriptions. The hourglass lingers as a kind of gentle clock of grief. In science and modern design, as the modern world embraced electronics and atomic precision, the hourglass was thoroughly surpassed, yet oddly. it also reappeared. In design, it became a minimalist icon, its shape used in furniture, lamps, and even logos. In user interfaces, the digital spinning hourglass became a symbol of waiting on computers, used in early versions of Microsoft Windows. Though replaced now by spinning circles, its memory persists. In experimental physics, hourglass patterns are observed in magnetic and quantum structures entirely unrelated to sand, but still metaphorically connected by shape. In this sense, the hourglass survives not just as a timekeeper, but as a visual reference for passage, narrowing, and inversion. The hourglass in the age of acceleration. We live now in the age of milliseconds in touchscreens and time zones, timers and stopwatches, reminders and atomic clocks that lose less than a second over millions of years. Time is measured so precisely that it often becomes invisible. We move from one task to the next, one notification to the next, rarely aware of how time actually feels. In such a world, the hourglass has found a quiet resurgence as an object of contemplation. Sold in wellness stores for mindful pauses, given as gifts to symbolize patience, presence, or transitions, used in therapy and counseling to ground sessions, displayed on desks as reminders to step away, to breathe, to slow down. You can still flip it, you can still watch it, and as the sand falls, you can feel perhaps more than ever that something is passing. Not a sound, not a number, but a subtle disappearance. Closing reflections. The hourglass is not obsolete, not really. It has simply changed its role from tool to teacher, from instrument to icon. It no longer regulates sermons or ship watches, but it still shows us time. Slowly, silently, physically. It allows you to see what clocks conceal, that time, however abstract, is always in motion, always slipping. And unlike a stopwatch, the hourglass offers no alarm. It ends with nothing but absence. The sand is simply gone. That perhaps is its quiet lesson. That time is not a moment but a material, something to hold, turn, and let go. So next time you see an hourglass, whether in a museum or a board game or a meditation room, watch it for a while. Let it remind you. That time doesn't tick. It falls. Story 4. Counting Stars, Babylonian Astronomers and the Birth of Hours. Night in ancient Babylonia was not a time of rest. It was a time of observation, quiet, meticulous, and eternal. Long before telescopes, satellites, or wristwatches, people looked up at the sky not for wonder but for order. The stars, with their silent choreography, offered something few things on Earth could provide: predictability. High atop ziggurats, the step towers of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, priest astronomers watched the heavens with practiced eyes. They tracked risings and settings, alignments and absences, charting the slow dance of celestial bodies that repeated with divine precision. From this long, patient study came something revolutionary: the division of the day into structured parts. Not merely morning and night, but hours, and not arbitrary hours, but systematized, recorded, and named segments of time. This is the story of how the Babylonians with clay tablets and naked eyes gave us the rhythm of the day. A rhythm we still follow, thousands of years later. Before the hour, time by occasion. In the earliest Mesopotamian settlements, time was not tracked by numbers, but by events. When the sun touched the horizon, it was time to eat. When the stars came out, it was time to light the fires. When the fields dried from dew, it was time to harvest. This method, event-based timekeeping, is common in many early societies. It is natural, intuitive, and rooted in lived experience, but it is also flexible and imprecise. As cities grew, administration expanded, and temples began to manage agricultural labor, record-keeping, and ritual calendars. Something more exact was needed. Enter the astronomer priests of Babylon. The rise of the ziggurat observatories. By the second millennium BCE, cities like Ur, Nippur, and Babylon had built large ziggurats temple towers that reached into the sky. These structures were more than monuments. They were platforms for watching the stars. From atop these platforms, astronomers could track the rising and setting of planets and stars, observe lunar phases and eclipses, note the first appearance of stars after sunset, a critical timekeeping event known as the heliacal rising. Their tools were simple: sighting rods, plumb lines, and above all, observation over generations. Through this long watching, patterns emerged. The sun followed a predictable arc. The moon cycled every 29.5 days. Certain stars rose at specific times of year. These patterns became the backbone of Mesopotamian calendrical science. Base 60 and the mathematics of time. One of the most enduring legacies of Babylonian astronomy is their numerical system. Unlike our base 10 decimal system, the Babylonians used a sexagesimal system, base 60. Why 60? It is highly divisible: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, 60. It allowed for easier calculation with fractions in a world without decimals. This system proved ideal for astronomical measurements, where angles and time needed to be divided into smaller parts. From this base 60 system, we eventually inherited 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These divisions were not arbitrary. They were born from a need to divide the sky with accuracy and from a cultural mathematics that made it feasible. The creation of hours. The exact moment when the day was first divided into 24 hours is uncertain, but by the first millennium BCE, Babylonian texts show that astronomers had begun to divide both day and night into equal parts. The number 12 was especially significant, tied to the lunar calendar, zodiac, and agricultural cycles. It's likely that the 24-hour day originated from 12 hours of daylight, 12 hours of night. These were temporal hours, meaning their actual length varied with the seasons: longer in summer, shorter in winter. Still, the concept of a divided day, where tasks, rituals, and observations could be timed to regular intervals, was a major advancement. The Babylonians didn't just look at the sky, they measured it, recorded it, and structured life around it. The Mulapin and celestial records. One of the most remarkable artifacts from this period is the Mulapin, a set of clay tablets compiled around 1000 BCE, though based on observations centuries older. The Mulapin includes lists of constellations and stars, seasonal rising and setting times, divisions of the day and night into watches, calendrical data for agriculture and rituals. The tablets show how closely astronomy, religion, and administration were linked. The night sky was divided into 3 watches, later expanded to 12 beru, or double hours, reflecting increasing granularity in timekeeping. These records show that Babylonians didn't just observe, they calculated, standardized, and transmitted knowledge across generations. Time and the gods. In Babylonian cosmology, time was not just a practical matter, it was divine. The movements of planets, eclipses, and stellar alignments were seen as messages from the gods. The sky was a tablet, and the stars were its script. Time was sacred, and those who could interpret it, the astronomer priests, held tremendous power. Festivals, royal decrees, and agricultural decisions were often based on celestial readings. Kings consulted astronomers before battles. Farmers waited for the rising of Sirius before planting. The measurement of time in this context was both technical and spiritual. It was a way to align human activity with cosmic order. A legacy that ticks on. By the time the Babylonian Empire gave way to Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman rule, its astronomical legacy had already spread. Greek astronomers like Hipparchus and Ptolemy built upon Babylonian records, adopting the base 60 divisions, the 12-hour model, and even some star catalogs. The very idea of measured time, structured into equal segments, owes a profound debt to Babylonian thought. Today, when you glance at a clock, schedule a meeting, or calculate an angle, you are, whether you know it or not, inheriting that legacy. In Section 2, we'll explore how Babylonian timekeeping influenced Greek astronomy, passed through Alexandria, and laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution. But for now, imagine standing atop a ziggurat under the open sky, clay tablet in hand, stars overhead, and the slow sweep of time measured not in seconds, but in celestial certainty. When did the stars become numbers, and when did we begin to live by them? A star rises, and a priest records it on clay. A generation later, another priest does the same. Then another and another. Over time, what was once a fleeting moment, a glimmer on the horizon, becomes part of a pattern, a system, a science. This, perhaps more than anything else, defines the Babylonian contribution to timekeeping, not the invention of the hour but the discipline of recording. Now, as we move forward through history, we follow that discipline as it passes from Mesopotamian riverbanks to Greek observatories, Egyptian libraries, and eventually to the tools of empire and science. Babylonian astronomy in transition. By the 6th century BCE, Babylon was no longer the sole intellectual center of the world. The region had passed into the hands of the Achaemenid Persians, and later the Seleucids, who brought with them Hellenistic culture following the campaigns of Alexander the Great. Yet instead of being erased, Babylonian astronomical knowledge was preserved, even revered, by Greek scholars. The Greeks admired the Mesopotamians' long observational records, their predictive models, and their uncanny ability to correlate celestial events with earthly happenings. In turn, they began to integrate this knowledge into their own frameworks, more geometric, more theoretical, but no less reliant on those careful nightly notes carved into wet clay. Hipparchus and the division of the day. The Greek astronomer Hipparchus, working in the 2nd century BCE, is often credited with formalizing the division of the day into 24 equinoctial hours, that is, hours of equal length, regardless of the season. Unlike the Babylonian temporal hours, which expanded and contracted with the daylight, Hipparchus proposed fixed divisions, likely inspired by Babylonian use of base 60 and their observations of the stars' consistent movements. He also created star catalogs based on Babylonian records, used Babylonian eclipse data to improve lunar theories, adopted Babylonian sexagesimal math to express angles in time. In many ways, Hipparchus did not invent so much as he translated, turning empirical Babylonian methods into a Greek geometric framework. This shift from observation to theory marked a new phase in astronomy and timekeeping. The Alexandrian synthesis. In Alexandria, the famed Egyptian city of learning, Babylonian, Egyptian, and Greek knowledge coalesced. The Great Library of Alexandria, before its eventual destruction, housed not only Greek manuscripts, but also translations of Mesopotamian texts. There, scholars like Ptolemy, 2nd century CE, continued the work of Hipparchus, using Babylonian records to develop more advanced astronomical models. Ptolemy's Almagest became a central text in medieval astronomy, influencing Islamic, Christian, and Jewish scholars for over 1,000 years. In it, he uses base 60 subdivisions of degrees, which later became minutes and seconds of arc, a division of the circle into 360 degrees, derived from Babylonian practice, an equatorial model of time, with 24 fixed hours, another Babylonian Greek synthesis, It's easy to overlook the clay roots of this knowledge when reading Ptolemy's polished Greek prose, filled with geometric diagrams and spherical models. But the foundational data, the careful tracking of Venus, Mars, and eclipses, all began on the rooftops of Babylonian temples. The persistence of the watch system. One lesser-known aspect of Babylonian timekeeping that endured was the division of night into watches. Originally practical a way to organize shifts for temple priests or city guards, these watches also corresponded to changes in the stars overhead. Babylonian tablets describe three primary watches: the evening watch, sunset to midnight; the middle watch, midnight to cockcrow; the morning watch, cockcrow to sunrise. Over time, this system became embedded in both military and religious life. The Romans later adopted a four-watch system for soldiers on patrol. Biblical texts reflect this model too. While not an hour-by-hour breakdown, the watch system shaped how time was lived in segments of duty, responsibility, and rest. Even as hours became standardized, the psychological time of watches felt in darkness, in silence, in shared labor continued. Babylonian calendars and religious time. Another key legacy was the lunisolar calendar, which attempted to reconcile the moon's 29.5-day cycle, the sun's 365-day year. Babylonians inserted intercalary months, extra months, to keep the calendar aligned, a practice that influenced the Hebrew calendar, later the Islamic lunar calendar, and aspects of the Christian liturgical year. Religious festivals, sacrificial schedules, and agricultural rituals all depended on the accurate prediction of lunar and solar cycles, a Babylonian specialty. Without their methods of intercalation and correction, ancient societies would have struggled to keep festivals in their proper seasons. Time would have drifted, crops would have been mistimed, ritual would have lost meaning. The quiet power of the tablet. It's worth pausing here to consider how this knowledge was stored. Not in scrolls, but on clay tablets, hardened in kilns or simply air-dried. Tens of thousands have survived, buried in the ruins of cities like Nineveh, Uruk, and Sippar. These tablets include star catalogs, eclipse predictions, planetary tables, omens and astrological records, mathematical time formulas. They were organized, indexed, and in many cases, copied across generations. Some tablets have notes from scribes correcting earlier calculations or commenting on unexpected deviations. This scientific tradition, empirical, conservative, and cumulative, was arguably the first of its kind. The Babylonians did not seek novelty, they sought continuity. Time to them was not invention, it was inheritance. An invisible inheritance. By the time of late antiquity, few people remembered the names of Babylonian astronomers. Their temples had crumbled. Their cities were abandoned or absorbed. Their language, Akkadian, faded into history. Yet their legacy lived on in the divisions of time, the measurements of the heavens, and the way we map the day. We still count 24 hours in a day. Divide hours into 60 minutes. Subdivide minutes into 60 seconds. Use degrees to track the sky. Follow calendars born of lunar logic. And while we no longer kneel on ziggurat rooftops to read the stars, we do look at phones, screens, and clocks, each one silently ticking in a rhythm first felt thousands of years ago, when a priest pressed a stylus into a tablet and whispered the name of a star. In Section 3, we will explore how Babylonian timekeeping filtered into the Islamic Golden Age, influenced medieval European astronomy, and became a quiet cornerstone of the scientific revolution even as its origins were largely forgotten. But before we go on, reflect for a moment. How much of your day is ruled by numbers first written in clay? By the time the last of the Babylonian scribes set down his stylus, The world he inhabited was already fatting. The great cities of Mesopotamia had weathered conquest, drought, and shifting empires. Yet the system of time he helped build with its hours, watches, and sexagesimal divisions did not vanish. Instead, it sank quietly into the foundations of newer traditions. Over the centuries, as scholars in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Paris studied the heavens, they did so using tables, concepts, and mathematical systems developed centuries earlier on the rooftops of Babylon, often unknowingly, often without credit. The story of modern timekeeping of fixed hours, calibrated calendars, and mechanical clocks owes much to the Babylonians. This is the story of how that influence spread invisibly across cultures, into science, and into every device that now governs our lives. Islam's astronomical inheritance. During the Islamic Golden Age, 8th–13th centuries CE, scholars in the Abbasid Caliphate worked tirelessly to recover, translate, and expand upon ancient knowledge. Baghdad's House of Wisdom became a hub of astronomical research, combining Greek, Persian, Indian, and Babylonian insights. Texts from Babylonia were translated into Arabic, often via earlier Syriac translations. Though names changed and diagrams improved, the core ideas, the division of the day, the tracking of planetary motion, the base 60 numerical systems remained. Muslim astronomers such as al-Battani al-Bayknius, al-Zarqali Arzeshul, al-Khwarizmi used Babylonian and Greek techniques to build Zayd's astronomical handbooks filled with tables for prayer times, calendar corrections, and star positions. These tables, copied widely, helped to preserve the Babylonian approach to structured, mathematical time. In particular, the 24-hour day, the division of the hour into 60 minutes, and the continued use of astrological watches in religious and civic life all carried Babylonian DNA. Medieval Europe, clocks and calendars. As Islamic scholarship spread into medieval Spain and Sicily, European scholars began to encounter these texts. They were translated from Arabic into Latin, forming the basis of medieval astronomical education. Names changed again. Al-Khwarizmi became Algorithmi, and Ptolemy's Almagest re-entered Europe through Arabic intermediaries. But beneath the layers of language was the same structure of Babylonian-inspired timekeeping. By the 13th and 14th centuries, mechanical clocks began to appear in European monasteries and towns. These early clocks, large, heavy, gear-driven machines, did not invent time divisions. They displayed them. They rang bells at fixed intervals, a notion directly descended from Babylonian concepts of equal hours and temporal divisions. Time, once dependent on the sun and the body, now ticked independently, but its unit, the hour, had already been defined centuries earlier. The enduring sexagesimal system. Even as the decimal system rose to dominance in mathematics and commerce, the sexagesimal structure persisted in astronomy, navigation, and, crucially, timekeeping. To this day, we still use 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, 360 degrees in a circle, 15 degrees per hour of Earth's rotation. These are not modern choices. They are ancient Babylonian legacies. Even scientific notation in astronomy, right ascension, declination, and sidereal tracking rely on divisions first laid out in cuneiform. The irony is that many of the scientists and engineers who carried these systems forward from Copernicus to Newton likely never read a Babylonian tablet. Their knowledge passed through layers of translation and tradition until it was assumed to be natural. But it wasn't natural, it was chosen, it was recorded, it was preserved. By people watching stars rise over the Euphrates. Time's disappearance into the everyday. Today, our relationship with time is almost invisible. We glance at clocks, We schedule in apps. We measure workouts, meetings, and commutes in slices of 15, 30, or 60 minutes. Few of us wonder why the clock is structured this way. Fewer still know that it began in a land of reeds and clay, where astronomers watched the slow arcs of Venus and Mars with nothing more than patience and chalked lines. We don't use gnomons, sundials, or ziggurats, but we still live by the division of day and night into hours, a concept refined by those early observers who learned that predictability could be extracted from the sky. Their tools were crude, their math was laborious, their world was fragile, but their understanding of time as regular, divisible, and measurable survived empires. And now it governs us all. The quiet persistence of the Babylonian mind. In many ways, the Babylonian approach to time was a paradox. It was sacred, yet intensely practical. It was based on observation, but driven by numerical structure. It was empirical, yet cosmological, connecting human events to the sky. And perhaps that's why it endured. Because it didn't reduce time to just a number. It acknowledged time's complexity, its flow, its symbolism, its role in organizing both ritual and labor. Even now, when we speak of time zones, daylight savings, or leap years, we echo the Babylonian compromise, trying to fit a circular, cosmic motion into the linear logic of human life. A final reflection. So the next time you check the hour, remember this. That number came from clay. That minute was once a star rising over the desert. That second is counted in a system older than the alphabet you're reading now. You do not need to know the names of the stars or the gods who once governed them. You only need to know this. We live in Babylon's time. Story 5. The Stone Calendar: How the Mayans Measured Eternity. Deep in the jungles of Mesoamerica, among the moss-draped temples and pyramids swallowed by trees, lie stones carved with silence. They are marked not with numbers, but with symbols, dots, bars, faces, and glyphs, each a measure, a marker, a fragment of time. For the ancient Maya, time was not simply passed. It was kept, built, and sustained. And more than that, time was alive, a force to be honored, feared, and maintained through ritual and knowledge. In the ruins of cities like Tikal, Kapan, Palenque, and Chichen Itza, the Mayans built structures not only for worship or rule, but to track the heavens, to mark the cycles of days, and to preserve the eternal return of cosmic rhythms. This is the story of how the Maya carved calendars from stone, not just to tell time, but to inhabit it. A civilization obsessed with time. The Mayan civilization, flourishing roughly from 2000 BCE to 1500 CE, was among the most mathematically advanced of the ancient world. Though best known today for their dramatic pyramids and mysterious collapse, the Maya were, above all, timekeepers. They developed multiple calendars working in tandem, an advanced vigesimal-based 20 numbering system, a concept of zero centuries before Europe, precise astronomical observations of the sun, moon, Venus, and eclipses. But these achievements were not isolated or academic. For the Maya, keeping the calendars aligned was a spiritual obligation. Their gods moved through time in cycles. Their rulers claimed divine authority by aligning themselves with those cycles. To measure time was to intervene in destiny. The three calendars, a web of time. Unlike modern societies, which rely on a single calendar system, usually solar, the Maya used three interlocking calendars, each tracking a different aspect of time. 1. The Tzolk'in, the sacred calendar, 260 days. 13 numbers times 20 named days equals 260 unique combinations. No known direct connection to solar or lunar cycles. Possibly tied to human gestation, agricultural rhythms, or ritual timing. Every person born received a Tzolk'in date, a combination of a number and a day name. This date influenced their personality, destiny, and ceremonial role. Priests used the Tzolk'in to schedule rituals, predict omens, and maintain cosmic balance. This calendar was cyclical, repeating continuously a spiritual rhythm through which the gods moved. To the Hob, the solar calendar, 365 days. 18 months of 20 days each equals 360, plus 5 nameless days Wayeb, considered unlucky. Tracked agricultural seasons and the solar year. The Hob was a civil calendar, used for planting, harvesting, and taxation. It was less mystical than the Tzolk'in, but still infused with religious meaning. Each day had both a Tzolk'in and Hob designation. The full combination repeated once every 52 years, a period known as a calendar round. 3. The long count calendar of eternity. The long count tracked the linear passage of time from a mythic starting point, August 11, 3114 BCE, in our Gregorian calendar. It worked like this. 1 kn equals 1 day. 1 winel equals 20 kn equals 20 days. 1 ton equals 18 winel equals 360 days. 1 katan equals 20 ton equals 7,200 days. 1 baktan equals 20 katan equals 144,000 days. This structure allowed the Maya to date events thousands of years into the past and future, unlike many ancient systems, which simply repeated. Monuments often include long count dates, carved in stone to mark births, deaths, accessions, or astronomical events. Each date in the long count looked something like this: 12, 19, 13, 15, 12, indicating the number of baktons, kayatons, tons, winels, and kayans since the base date. It was precise, it was scalable, and it was carved in stone to outlast memory. Carving time, the stele and temples. To the Maya, stone was more than building material. It was a canvas for time. Cities were filled with steely tall stone slabs inscribed with dates and glyphs. These were not just monuments, they were temporal markers, linking past, present, and divine cycles. Every major event, a ruler's birth, a war, a dedication, was tied to a date in the long count, often accompanied by the Tzolk'in and Hob names as well. Some temples, like the Temple of Inscriptions at Palenque, were built to align with specific calendar events. Others, like the El Castillo Pyramid at Chichén Itzá, were constructed to interact with sunlight during solstices and equinoxes, casting shadows in the shape of serpents. These were not just structures, they were instruments, cosmic clocks in stone. Astronomy as religion. Mayans were not passive observers. They calculated future eclipses, predicted the positions of Venus, and aligned cities with celestial phenomena. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving pre-Columbian books, includes an eclipse table with astonishing precision. The planet Venus was especially important. Its cycles tracked in 584-day intervals, connected to war, fate, and royal authority. Mayan priests knew that every 5 Venus years equals 8 solar years, and their tables reflect this understanding. These cycles were integrated into calendar rituals and used to guide decisions, not because the Maya worshipped planets in the modern sense, but because they saw the heavens as part of the living order. The 2012 misunderstanding. In recent years, the Mayan long count gained fame, or rather, notoriety, due to the supposed end of the world in December 2012. This was based on the completion of a Baktan cycle, akin to the turning of a millennium. The date 130000, which occurred on December 21, 2012, marked the end of one great cycle and the beginning of another. There's no evidence the Maya believed this date signified destruction. In fact, some monuments refer to dates far beyond 2012. Time, for the Maya, was not apocalyptic, it was cyclical, renewing, and endlessly unfolding. The misunderstanding reflects a modern discomfort with endings. For the Maya, a cycle's end was also its beginning. A living system silenced. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they brought steel, horses, and new gods, but also a new calendar. The destruction of Mayan books and the collapse of native rule severed the continuity of calendar knowledge. Though aspects survived in rural communities, the broader system fell into disuse. What remained were the stones covered in glyphs, silent yet persistent. In the 20th century, scholars began to decipher these glyphs, revealing a civilization obsessed not with conquest or permanence, but with the measurement of time itself. A civilization that counted not years or reigns, but Tun, Kayatun, and Baktun, whose calendar didn't count down but spiraled onward. In Section 2, we'll explore the cultural role of calendar keepers, how Mayan cities used time to structure society, and how the calendar was carried into daily life. But before that, pause and imagine. A pyramid aligned to the sun. A stone slab marked with stars. A priest watching Venus rise again, just as it did 584 days before. What would it feel like to live in time measured not by hours, but by eternities? In the world of the ancient Maya, time was not merely measured, it was tended, nurtured, and intervened with. It was treated as a living structure, woven into every facet of life: agriculture, architecture, warfare, sacrifice, and the coronation of kings. And at the center of this intricate system were the calendar priests, the Ajkanob, those who worked the sun. They did not just track days, they understood their souls. Let us now walk through the daily, seasonal, and ceremonial life of the Maya, to see how time flowed not from the top of a clock tower, but from the mouths of trained keepers, the carvings of stoneworkers, and the movements of the gods above. The Ajkn, priests of time. The Ajkn were sacred specialists. More than priests, they were astrologers, historians, counselors, and ritual interpreters. Their training could last years, often passed through hereditary lines or elite priesthoods. Each Ajkn was tasked with interpreting the Tzolk'in to select auspicious days for marriages, births, or war, conducting ritual to maintain harmony between human affairs and cosmic cycles, calculating eclipses, Venus risings, and seasonal transitions, advising rulers on divinely sanctioned timing for political decisions. This role was not symbolic. In Mayan society, improper timing of events could lead to drought, defeat, or divine anger. The calendar priest was, in many ways, the central technologist of the state. Daily timekeeping without clocks. The Maya did not measure time in hours or minutes. There were no mechanical clocks, and likely not even water clocks in widespread use. Instead, time was observed and intuited through the sun's shadow, especially on solstices and equinoxes, chirping of cicadas or frogs, natural indicators of season, cultural timing, morning prayers, midday rituals, and evening fires all kept rhythm without need for devices. Buildings were constructed to interact with sunlight, allowing priests to track the year with remarkable accuracy. Yet curiously, this civilization so advanced in calendars did not develop precise daily divisions like Babylonian hours or Egyptian sun clocks. The focus was not on exact intervals, but on alignments. Time was a pattern to walk within, not a grid to manage. Time as a tool of power. Rulers and nobles used the calendar to legitimize their authority. Inscriptions often recorded that a king's accession, battle, or temple dedication occurred on an auspicious date, chosen by the priests and sanctioned by celestial order. These records were carved into stelae and buildings, often in long count format, tying each event back to the original creation date 13,000,000. Some examples. The reign of Ka-Inish-Janab, Pakal of Palenque was chronicled with intricate time counts, linking him to cosmic cycles. Kapan's rulers constructed monumental staircases, filled with glyphs showing their lineage aligned with Kayatan completions. At Quirigua, massive stelae celebrated calendrical milestones, rather than battles emphasizing time as the true source of legitimacy. To command the calendar was to command history. Ritual time, the 52-year cycle. The calendar round, formed by the interweaving of the 260-day Tzolk'in and 365-day Hob, repeated every 18,980 days or 52 solar years. This cycle held enormous spiritual significance. Its completion marked the end of a period and the renewal of the world's balance. Though different from the Aztec New Fire ceremony, it's believed that the Maya also marked these moments with major festivals, rituals, and perhaps even human sacrifices to ensure the continuation of the sun. In these ceremonies, fires were extinguished, offerings made, and renewal sought a way to reset the spiritual clock. Time in the common person. For the elite, time was power, but for farmers, artisans, and traders, time was agricultural, seasonal, and personal. A farmer in the Yucatan highlands might not read long count glyphs, but he knew when the rainy season would begin, when to plant maize, which days in the Tzolk'in were good for marriages or dangerous for travel. Midwives would use the Tzolk'in to determine a child's fate. Craftsmen might carve talismans according to the day name of their client. Time was not just linear, it was encoded into the individual. Your birthday wasn't a number, it was a divine coordinate. The glyphs as clocks. Mayan glyphs are famously complex combinations of images, phonetic syllables, and conceptual signs. In the calendar system, these glyphs acted as both dates and functions. For example, Agil, the 20th day of the Tzolk'in, associated with kingship and endings. Kayan, a day of fertility and abundance. Kayatan glyphs, used to mark the end of 20-year cycles. Each glyph had multiple meanings: temporal, spiritual, and political, which required contextual reading by skilled scribes and priests. These glyphs were placed everywhere. In codices, painted on bark paper books. On ceramics, used in daily rituals. On architecture, guiding how temples should be entered or viewed. Even the act of carving time into stone was part of maintaining time. Without this sacred record, the cosmos might lose its rhythm. Venus, the war star. The planet Venus held deep significance in Mayan cosmology. Known as the war star, it was associated with violence, change, and rebirth. Priests tracked Venus cycles using the Venus table in the Dresden Codex, recording its appearances as morning and evening star. It was known that Venus's synodic cycle equals 584 days. Every 5 Venus years equals 8 solar years. Battles were sometimes timed to coincide with Venus risings. Inscriptions mark certain conquests as having occurred when Venus emerged from the underworld, a moment of divine power. To fight in sync with the stars was not superstition. It was strategy, religion, and symbolism in one. Architecture as calendar. Maya cities were not random collections of buildings. They were calendrical landscapes. El Castillo at Chichén Itzá. On the equinoxes, shadows form a serpent slithering down the steps, a cosmic event reenacted in architecture. E-group complexes. Temple clusters aligned to solar risings at solstices and equinoxes, used to track the solar year with architectural precision. Kapan's ball court, aligned with the Milky Way, possibly used for ceremonial games tied to galactic events. The cities were observatories, stage sets, and cosmic models designed not for utility, but for alignment. Each stone was placed with temporal intention. In Section 3, we will explore how the Mayan calendar system declined, what happened to the knowledge after the Spanish conquest, how modern archaeologists reconstructed the calendar, and what it means today. But before moving on, consider this. In your world, time flows forward. In theirs, it turned like a wheel. What if you saw your life not as a line, but as a return a day you were born into again and again? Time turned slowly in the Maya world, in spirals and layers, in sacred intervals and nested cycles. But in the 16th century, the rhythm was broken. When Spanish ships reached the shores of Mesoamerica, they brought steel, muskets, and missionaries. They also brought a different calendar, based on Christian feasts and Roman timekeeping. It was a calendar of months, saints, days, and linear reckoning, one that left little room for the Maya's layered view of eternity. And yet, the Maya calendar never fully died. In this final section, we trace its decline, preservation, and rediscovery, and consider how a system built for gods and kings might still speak to us today. The collapse of timekeeping. The Spanish conquest, beginning in the early 1500s, was swift and brutal. Cities fell, temples burned, rulers were executed. But perhaps the greatest loss came not from swords or smallpox, but from the systematic destruction of knowledge. Spanish friars, especially under Bishop Diego de Landa, ordered the burning of Mayan books. In 1562, Landa oversaw the destruction of countless codices, declaring them superstition and lies of the devil. In a single act, centuries of calendrical observation and ritual wisdom were turned to ash. Yet even Landa, despite his fervor, realized the system had value. He attempted to record the Mayan glyphs and calendar logic, creating a confused and flawed transliteration. Ironically, his account would centuries later become a key resource in decoding the very script he tried to erase. Survivals in silence. While much was lost, the calendar did not vanish completely. It lived on in rural villages, oral traditions, and seasonal rituals practiced quietly, out of sight of colonial authorities. In parts of Guatemala, Yucatan, and Chiapas, modern-day AJKij, daykeepers, still conduct ceremonies based on the 260-day Tzolk'in. They use bundles of sticks to count days, prayers and offerings tied to day names, calendrical readings for births, illnesses, and blessings. These surviving traditions, syncretized with Catholic festivals, represent an unbroken thread from the classic Maya period to the present. Though the long count fell into disuse, the sacred calendar remained, hidden in plain sight. Rediscovering the glyphs. For centuries, the Mayan script remained a mystery. Early European scholars mistook it for purely pictographic writing or symbolic art. Only in the 20th century did linguists begin to crack the code. Key breakthroughs included Tatyana Proskuryakov, 1950s, showed that inscriptions told historical narratives, not just ceremonial events. Yuri Norizov, 1950-70, demonstrated that the script was phonetic, not just symbolic drawing on Landa's confused alphabet. Linda Scheel, David Stewart, and others, 1970s-1990, expanded the decipherment and reinterpreted major monuments. As glyphs were read, a clearer picture emerged. The dates carved on temples were not vague mysticism, they were mathematically precise records of events, births, and deaths, counted in Tun, Kayatan, and Bakdun. The calendar had been there all along, carved in stone sentences waiting for someone to listen. The 2012 phenomenon, a cycle misunderstood. In the early 2000s, interest in the Maya calendar exploded not among scholars, but in popular media. Books, documentaries, and films claimed that December 21, 2012 marked the end of the world, based on the completion of a Bakdun cycle, 130000. But this interpretation was flawed. For the Maya, the number 13 was sacred, not ominous. The date simply marked the end of one cycle, and the beginning of another, much like a new millennium in our calendar. No Maya texts predict apocalypse. In fact, some inscriptions mention future dates well beyond 2012, including one over 4,000 years into the future. The 2012 panic may have faded, but it served as a reminder. The Maya calendar still fascinates, even if it is often misunderstood. Modern legacy. Today, the calendar has returned to visibility, if not full use. Daykeepers continue their practice in parts of Guatemala and southern Mexico. Maya scholars work to revitalize language and calendar literacy. Tourists climb pyramids built as solar observatories, often unaware of their original purpose. Museums and universities now house the remaining codices. Only 4 have survived. The Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, the Grolier Codex, authenticity once debated, now largely accepted. And every December 21st, curious minds still ask what the calendar says, not out of fear, but wonder. What the Maya measured. Perhaps the most remarkable fact is that the Maya were not tracking time for productivity, industry, or trade. They were tracking cycles of the cosmos, movements of planets, seasons, births, deaths, and the shifting balance of divine forces. Their calendar did not merely tell you what day it was. It told you what kind of day it was, its energy, its fate, its spirit. In this, it resembled astrology, agriculture, and spiritual weather forecasting all at once. And despite lacking telescopes, metal tools, or written numbers as we know them, the Maya calendar was more accurate than the Julian calendar, aligned to the tropical year within hours, able to project millennia into past and future. This was a technology of the mind and of careful, generational observation. A final reflection. In a world governed by clocks, we might wonder what it means to live in a world of cycles. To be born not just on a date, but under a named day with character. To walk through a city built to shadow the solstice. To mark history not with kings and wars, but with the movement of Venus across the sky. To measure time not in efficiency, but in eternity. The Maya did not forget that we live within time, but also that time lives within us. So as we glance at the hour on our screens, somewhere in a village in the Guatemalan highlands, a daykeeper lights incense, recites prayers, and marks the day with stones and memory. The cycle continues. Story 6. Measuring time with water clepsydras of the ancient world. Imagine a world with no ticking clocks, no digital displays, no mechanical gears. A world where the sun and stars guided the day, but cloudy skies could disrupt everything. What then could measure time when the heavens were hidden? Enter the clepsydra, the water clock. A device so simple in concept, yet so quietly transformative that it helped shape law courts, astronomy, and the daily rhythms of ancient life across continents. In this section, we journey into the earliest methods of measuring time with water, exploring how civilizations from Egypt to China counted seconds with dripping vessels and flowing bowls, one drop, one moment at a time. What is a clepsydra? The term clepsydra comes from the Greek words kleptein, to steal, and hide or water, meaning water thief. It referred to any device that measured time by the flow of water, usually in one of 2 basic forms. Outflow clepsydra, a container with a small hole near the base. Water flowed out slowly, and the falling water level was marked against a time scale. Inflow clepsydra, water dripped into a vessel at a steady rate, and time was measured by the rising water level. Some were basic, just clay bowls. Others, especially in later periods, evolved into elaborate mechanisms with gears, floats, and automata. What united them all was this: a predictable, measurable flow, independent of sun or stars. Egypt, the first water timekeepers. The earliest known clepsydras come from ancient Egypt, as far back as the 16th century BCE. One surviving example is the Karnak clepsydra, found in the Temple of Karnak and dating to the reign of Amenhotep III. Made of stone, it was a deep bowl with sloped sides and graduated markings carved inside. Water would drain through a small hole, and the falling level indicated the passage of time. But these weren't for general public use. They were likely kept by temple priests who needed to measure time for nighttime rituals when no sun was available, astrological observations, precise timing of incense offerings. The clepsydra provided a quiet, steady heartbeat in the temple ticking in water, not sound. Interestingly, Egyptian clepsydras were often seasonally adjusted. Since daylight hours varied throughout the year, time divisions weren't fixed. The gradations inside the clock compensated for solar shifts, a reminder that early timekeeping was more fluid literally and conceptually than ours today. Babylon and beyond. While the Babylonians preferred astronomical timekeeping, some evidence suggests they also used clepsydras particularly for night watches in observatories and astrological timing. Texts reference vessels that measured time through liquid flow, often in military or ritual contexts. Like their Egyptian counterparts, they likely required a steady water source and careful calibration skills managed by priest astronomers. Elsewhere, the idea of water clocks traveled widely. India, ancient Sanskrit texts mention gati yantras, or watt or time-measuring devices. These were used in temples and for regulating daily routines. Persia used clepsydras to regulate irrigation cycles in desert environments, with village timekeepers managing complex shared water rights. In many cases, water clocks were less about abstract time and more about fair use whether of labor, rituals, or resources. Greece, clepsydras in courtrooms. In classical Athens, the clepsydra found a new and very specific role: the law court. Athenian trials were often short and citizen-led. To ensure fairness, the length of speeches was timed using a clepsydra. A standard amount of water was poured into a vessel, and as it drained, the allotted speaking time expired. Some key features. Non-reversible. Once started, time flowed continuously just like a case. Publicly visible, so no one could claim bias. Stopped for interruptions. If a document needed to be read, the clepsydra was physically halted. This use of water clocks was deeply democratic. Time was equalized, regulated, and liquid, much like the process of justice itself. Rome, the clepsydra goes public. The Romans adopted the Greek clepsydra, but began using it for broader civic purposes. In military camps, clepsydras marked night watches, vigiliae. Guards changed shifts based on time measured in water flow. This allowed for better logistics, synchronized duty across large camps, efficient command structures even after sunset. In urban settings, some Roman public baths used clepsydras to limit bathing times. Wealthy citizens installed decorative clepsydras in gardens not for function, but as signs of erudition. Still, for most Romans, time remained a matter of bells, sundials, and natural cues. The water clock remained more elite than everyday. The science of flow. One of the great challenges of clepsydra design was achieving a steady flow rate. Water pressure decreases as a vessel empties, making time measurement nonlinear unless corrected. Innovations to address this included conical or step shapes to regulate flow, float regulators to equalize pressure, feedback mechanisms in advanced designs. But precision remained difficult. It wasn't until much later, especially in Islamic and Chinese designs, that water clocks approached true mechanical accuracy. Yet even in their simplest forms, clepsydras proved reliable when the sky was obscured. Time had to be measured at night. Regular intervals were required without sunlight. They represented one of humanity's earliest attempts to free time from the heavens. At the end of this section, we find ourselves in a curious place. The clepsydra, so humble, so quiet, helped ancient societies synchronize events, guide rituals, and democratize courts. But it was never perfect. Flow varied, readings drifted, and as civilizations rose and fell, water clocks were abandoned, reimagined, and sometimes forgotten altogether. In the next section, we will trace the evolution of water clocks into the high machines of the Islamic Golden Age and Imperial China, where gears and innovation brought clepsydras to a level of complexity nearly rivaling modern devices. But before that, can you imagine trusting your fate in court or your job on night watch to a slow dripping bowl of water? By the first centuries of the Common Era, simple clepsydras, bowls, and jars had already served the world for thousands of years. They had measured prayers and punishments, irrigated fields, and guided rituals in temples from Egypt to India. But in the hands of medieval scientists, engineers, and court artisans, the clepsydra was no longer just a bowl with a hole. It became a machine, a centerpiece of scientific ingenuity, imperial prestige, and cosmic order. In this section, we follow the second life of the water clock, as it evolved into automated towers, celestial globes, and musical fountains in the Islamic world and East Asia. A story of gears, gravity, and quiet flowing time. The Islamic Golden Age, from vessels to virtuosity. Between the 8th and 14th centuries CE, the Islamic world experienced a flourishing of science, mathematics, and engineering. As scholars in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba translated Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge, they also improved upon it. Among the fields they transformed was timekeeping. Al-Jazari, the master engineer. In the early 13th century, Ismail al-Jazari, an inventor from Upper Mesopotamia, compiled his masterpiece. Blue Book, the Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices, 1206 CE. Within its pages were detailed illustrations and descriptions of over 50 machines, including automata, self-moving devices, water-raising machines, intricate water clocks. His most famous clocks: the elephant clock, a pan-cultural timepiece combining Indian, Egyptian, and Chinese motifs. A float regulator ensured a steady flow of water, and automated figures struck symbols on the hour. A mahout, dragon, phoenix, and scribe all moved in sequence, a true multi-sensory show of mechanical time. The castle clock, perhaps his most advanced design. It featured a water reservoir, gears, automated doors that opened to reveal zodiac figures, and a mechanical falcon that dropped a ball every hour. Remarkably, this clock could be reprogrammed to change the timing of prayers, an early form of adjustable automation. These weren't toys or novelties. They represented a profound belief that mechanical knowledge could express divine harmony. The Chinese water clock tradition. While Islamic engineers pushed the boundaries of automata, Chinese innovators were developing equally sophisticated timekeeping, often on a grand architectural scale. Su Song and the Astronomical Clock Tower, 11th century. In the Northern Song dynasty, c. 1090 CE, Su Song, a statesman, astronomer, and engineer, built one of the most complex water clocks ever conceived. A 30-foot tall clock tower in the imperial capital of Kaifeng. Used a water wheel escapement to regulate flow, a mechanism centuries ahead of its time. Rotating celestial sphere showing the position of stars. Mechanical puppets that emerged on the hour to strike bells and gongs. A time reporting system visible from the tower for public viewing. This was not merely for amusement. Su Song's tower functioned as a scientific instrument, public clock, an imperial statement of order and knowledge. Unfortunately, the tower was destroyed during wartime in the 1120s, but Su Song's diagrams and records preserved the design, influencing generations of East Asian engineers. Key innovations in medieval clepsydras. Across cultures, several technological advances emerged that turned the humble clepsydra into a precision instrument. Float regulators maintained a constant pressure, ensuring uniform flow of water. Escapement mechanisms released power at regular intervals, a major precursor to mechanical clocks. Gear trains translated water flow into rotational movement, enabling clocks to display time visually. Automata integration gave clocks a spectacle function used in royal courts to show power and piety. Many of these ideas would later influence the mechanical clock revolution in Europe, but their origins lie here, in the water-driven machines of Baghdad, Damascus, Kaifeng, and Kyoto. The role of clepsydras in daily life. While grand towers and courtly clocks garnered attention, water clocks still played practical roles. In mosques, to time the 5 daily prayers. In monasteries, to regulate chanting and meditation. In palaces, to coordinate court rituals and audiences. In astronomy, to track transits, eclipses, and planetary risings. Their portability made them useful in locations where sundials failed at night, indoors, or on cloudy days. Some clocks were even built into portable boxes, used by astronomers traveling between cities, or by scholars observing the heavens from rooftops. Clepsydras and cultural identity. For Islamic and East Asian civilizations, timekeeping wasn't merely technical. It had profound philosophical and political implications. In Islamic societies, time was deeply tied to religious discipline, prayer times, fasting, and lunar months. In Confucian China, proper timekeeping was a sign of benevolent rule. The emperor was the son of heaven, expected to align earthly schedules with celestial harmony. In Buddhist monasteries, timing rituals with water clocks embodied the rhythm of mindful living. Thus, the clepsydra was not just a machine. It was a symbol of cosmic alignment, intellectual mastery, and civic order. As the medieval period waned, these water clocks began to fade. In Europe, the mechanical escapement clock would rise to dominance. The clepsydra, for all its elegance, could not compete with the precision and portability of spring-driven gears. And yet, even in decline, water clocks continued to influence design, inspire curiosity, and appear in art and architecture. They had made time visible, tangible, and even beautiful. But their story wasn't over yet. In the next section, we'll examine how the clepsydra disappeared, reappeared in scholarship, and left its mark on the development of modern horology, and how remnants of these devices still exist today, quietly flowing in museums, temples, and memory. But for now, pause and consider. What does it mean that civilizations across thousands of miles and centuries all turn to water to measure time? A quiet drop, a mirrored surface, a flowing past. Water clocks' clepsydras had ticked silently through millennia. From Egyptian temples to Chinese towers, they had dripped and flowed, marking time through nights and clouds when sun and stars were hidden. But eventually, the world moved on. This final section explores how and why the clepsydra was abandoned, what it left behind, and where in some quiet corners it still continues to tick. The rise of mechanical clocks. The decline of the clepsydra began in earnest in late medieval Europe, around the 13th century CE. The invention of the mechanical escapement, a device that regulated energy release, revolutionized how time could be measured. Now, instead of relying on gravity-fed water flow, clocks could use weights, gears, and eventually springs to produce uniform motion. Key developments. Salisbury Cathedral Clock, c. 1386, one of the oldest working mechanical clocks. Gear-driven, it struck bells without hands. Giovanni da Dondi, 14th century, built an astronomical clock in Padua, modeling planetary motions mechanically. By the 15th century, clock towers were rising across European cities, public symbols of civic order. Mechanical clocks were faster, more portable, and less sensitive to freezing temperatures or fluctuating flow rates. They worked indoors in winter and on ships. The water clock, for all its elegance, was becoming obsolete. Where the clepsydra lingered. Even so, clepsydras did not vanish overnight. In Persian and Central Asian villages, simple water clocks continued regulating irrigation into the 19th century. Farmers used them to divide time slots for canal access. In Buddhist monasteries in East Asia, small clepsydras remained in use for ritual timing, preserving the slow, flowing rhythm of sacred days. In some Islamic cities, public fountains incorporated clepsydra-like features not to mark time, but as aesthetic echoes of earlier devices. And in China, even after mechanical clocks were introduced by Jesuits in the 16th century, older traditions of water-powered astronomical instruments remained in memory and design. Rediscovery and study. As the world industrialized, the water clock slipped into obscurity. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, historians and archaeologists began piecing together its story. Excavations in Egypt revealed stone clepsydras from the New Kingdom. Translations of Islamic manuscripts brought Al-Jazari's automata to light. Reproductions of Su Song's tower were attempted by modern engineers. Scholars traced how hydraulic technology traveled across cultures, often more freely than politics or religion. Museums began building replicas, elephant clocks, Roman trial clepsydras, Chinese water wheels. These were no longer tools but artifacts of a forgotten way of marking time. The philosophy of flow. The clepsydra measured time not in ticks, but in drips. It captured time not as a linear arrow, but as a continuous stream, a metaphor that resonates differently than modern timekeeping. Some key contrasts. Clepsydra time, mechanical time. Fluid and continuous, discrete and segmented. Sensitive to nature, independent of environment. Visually analog, often invisible or abstract. Rooted in ritual, rooted in productivity. In some cultures, this older view of time, cyclical, flowing, embodied, never entirely disappeared. Where clepsydras still exist. Today, water clocks are rarely functional devices, but they endure in museums. Reconstructed elephant clocks, astronomical towers, and Greek clepsydras are displayed in major museums worldwide. Temples and monasteries. Some Buddhist centers still use water clocks for chants. Art and sculpture. Modern artists have created kinetic fountains and timepieces inspired by clepsydra's symbolic returns to natural time. Cultural memory. In literature, metaphors of time like water continue, echoing an ancient, liquid understanding of temporality. Even in language, the idea survives. Time slips away, time flows, time runs out. These expressions stem from the centuries when water was time's most faithful servant. The clepsydra's quiet legacy. While mechanical clocks conquered the world, the clepsydra left a subtle but lasting legacy. It showed that time could be regulated and visualized, even in darkness. It helped synchronize civil and religious life long before industrial standardization. It proved that engineering and philosophy could merge, that a machine could express cosmic order. And it connected people across vast distances, from Egyptian priests to Chinese astronomers, all united by a need to mark the passing of moments with something as universal as water. The clepsydra is gone, but the rhythm it kept, slow, patient, flowing, still lingers beneath the hum of modern clocks. Final reflection. Pause just for a moment and listen. No ticking, no flashing digits, just a drop, then another, then another. The clepsydra taught us not only to measure time, but to feel it as something that moves steadily, without rush, like a stream carving stone. Perhaps we've gained precision but lost something in the process. The patience, the ceremony, the awareness of each passing moment as a droplet, not a number. In a world ruled by nanoseconds and push notifications, there's something quietly radical in imagining time once kept by a bowl, a hole, and the steady pull of gravity. No alarms, no apps, just water whispering the moment is passing.